Yasas. What happens when you take two vibrant brothers that are descendants from the Greeks in Constantinople, embracing their American roots, and then ask them to serve up rich tales of traditions, cuisine, childhood memories, and a hearty dose of humor? You're about to find out. This is Baklava and Banter, your passport to all things Greek.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Baklava and Banter. I am Petraki.
And I'm Soto.
Welcome everybody and Happy New Year to everybody, as this is our first episode for 2025. Before we get into this first episode, Soto and I would like to express our well wishes to the citizens of Los Angeles as they are coping with the wildfires, not only within the Greek community, but every citizen in Southern California that is dealing with such tragedy. We want to wish you the best of luck in the upcoming future recovering from this tragedy. Now we'd like to welcome to the show. She is a award-winning author from the Central Coast of Australia. She is the author of Unpacking for Greece and Repacking for Greece. Please welcome to the show, Sally Jane Smith. Welcome, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'd just love to add a message as well for the people of LA. I was in LA for the first time just a few months ago in September. It was my first visit to the West Coast of the States. And yeah, as an Australian who has had personal experience of having to evacuate from wildfires, look, our hearts really go out to you guys. We're all watching you on the news and thinking about you.
Thanks, Sally. So, Sally, this, you sent me a copy of this book. It's a great book, like really good. And
you sound surprised, Peter.
No, I'm not at all. I'm not surprised at all. It's really, you know what it is? I give credit. I'm not an author, but I'm a person. If you put something in, I read anything and everything. So it's just one of those things that, I really love when people opening up about their personal stories. It's not something every author tends to do, but you really opened up your soul in this book. Talked about things that a lot of people wouldn't talk about. Just personal triumphs for you. So,
yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, the book took me a long time to write, and the first few drafts were not as personal. When I started writing the books, I intended them very much just to be a travel companion. And I hope they still are a travel companion for people who are going to Greece and don't know a great deal about the country.
Yeah.
But as I worked my way through the drafts of the book, I came to a realization that I guess I believe that if you are someone who writes memoir, if you are a memoirist, there's a contract between you and the reader, and that contract is not to hold back. And that doesn't mean you write every detail as it happens, because that could make for a very tedious and boring story. But it does mean that if there is something that is personal and is relevant to the journey, then there's almost a duty to disclose it. And so, it took me some places I did not expect to go.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, though. There's a term that you use in here, middle essence.
Yes.
And, at first when you use it, I wasn't really sure what you meant with it. But then as I read on, it made more and more sense to me on where you were going with this. But I want to loop back to the book. But first, you and I talked via email. You're talking about we have some things in common. I think you're talking about your grandmother was from Constantinople or spent some time in Constantinople.
A little bit further back than that, it was my great-great-grandmother.
Okay.
My father's father's mother's mother.
Okay.
She was an extraordinary woman. So we're talking, she was in Constantinople during the Crimean War.
Okay.
So her husband was a soldier and was posted there. So they weren't in the heart of the city of Constantinople. They were across the straits in what is now Uskudar on the Asian side.
Sure.
He was camped in a tent quite close to one of Florence Nightingale's hospitals.
Oh, wow.
And she was staying with the officers' wives in what she called a little palace of the Sultan, which I went over a few years ago to find. And she was there for 4.5 months. He ended up never being sent across to the battlefields. He spent the whole 4.5 months in one of the most incredible cities in the world. So I can't complain. But then she went on to live on 4 continents, sometimes in conditions of real brutal poverty. In fact, he ended up as a mercenary fighting in the American Civil War.
Wow.
So she moved all over the place following him around. And there's a fascinating story about her following him to New York because he was fighting with the Yankees and he ended up in New York at the end of the war. She followed him there. He didn't know she was coming. Kind of reading between the lines. I'm not sure how thrilled he was when she arrived. But she wrote a letter about her life, which is a very treasured, well, I'd say it's a possession of our family, but it's not. We have a copy of it. It's actually in a museum in South Africa.
Wow.
Because South Africa is where she ended up. And but there's that connection. I was quite excited because I actually haven't met any Greek Americans from Constantinople before. You're the first ones. I've met a few from Asia Minor, but not from Constantinople itself.
Well, we're looking for a place to send my mother for vacation. So maybe we'll send her down to Australia, Good luck with that.
I was going to say that I feel like I know your mother from your shows, and I was hoping that at no point in this interview will I say anything that will upset her.
She's our biggest fan and our biggest critic all at the same time.
Yeah. Wait till she sees
She's
this.
Brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. So, so going back to the book, it starts off with you going to Sri Lanka, and getting into a bus accident, and the injuries that occurred there for you. First, what was the point of going to? It kind of changed. That accident kind of changed the way you view traveling, correct?
It did, yes. And I wasn't even aware that that was happening to me. So I had quite an adventurous youth when it came to travel. I'm not saying that I was, out summiting Everest or hiking solo through the rainforests, but I did travel a lot, and I did travel alone, and I did tend to go places that weren't just kind of resort areas. When I was traveling solo in Sri Lanka, I was in my 30s, and yes, I had this quite traumatic bus accident that had a long-term effect on me physically. I still have the physical effects of the accident. But what I hadn't realized had happened was that it had also robbed me of that willingness to take on the world. And I didn't even think about it, because in my head I was still traveling, because I was, going overseas to visit my family, or going on a cruise with my sister, going with my partner, Adam, on road trips around Australia. Sure. And it was only when I got to this point of adolescence that you mentioned, Peter, which for me is like a period of adolescence, an uncomfortable time in the middle of our lives when we are moving into a new stage in our lives and start questioning a lot of things that we had assumed before, that I realized that this is what had been missing for me. I felt like I'd become trapped in the mundane. And the trip to Greece was my way of reclaiming myself. And I often laugh about it because, it's such a cliche, a middle-aged woman going to Greece to find herself. But Greece, people have been going to Greece to find themselves for thousands of years. You think about the Oracle of Delphi, and there on that temple were were carved the words, know thyself.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to go and find yourself somewhere, Greece is a good place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll eat good too.
Oh, you'll eat so good. So good.
But in the book you talk about the accidents and uh, the injuries and how you struggle with them. But then you go on to say you moved to Australia to be with your sister, and she had a wildlife park. Um,
Yes.
and how you basically was your time of recovery, not only physically but also emotionally for you. Now, and you talk about working in the park, and you working with these now these I'm curious, these kangaroos that you worked with, how many kangaroos did she have?
Dozens and dozens, because her wildlife sanctuary,
Yeah.
it does have what we call in the zoo trade captive animals, in that there are enclosures that have animals in them, but only when they have to be. So
Okay.
that's if there's a reason, because it would be dangerous for visitors, or because it would be dangerous for the animal, or if they're in a protected breeding program, or for
Okay.
some reason like that, they'll be in an enclosure. But most of her animals, and that includes all of her kangaroos and wallabies,
Mm-hmm.
are free ranging. They're just
Okay.
hopping around in acres and acres and acres of bushland.
Yeah.
So I couldn't give you a number, but there are hundreds and hundreds of kangaroos and wallabies, which are animals which look very similar to kangaroos, but are a different
Yeah.
species. In fact, just this morning, and I don't often post about the park, I just posted on social media, on Instagram and Facebook this morning, about an orphaned wombat
Oh.
that we have in care there. And usually we try, or I try, not to be too involved with the orphans,
Mm-hmm.
because the idea is to eventually release them into the wild, and you don't want them to be dependent or
Sure.
imprinted on human beings. But
Yeah.
this little wombat is blind as well as an
Okay.
orphan, which means I got to give him a cuddle. So I
uh
posted up a photo this morning. It's
that's
a fabulous place,
Yeah, that's awesome. My brother has a dog. I have a cat who's a warrior princess.
of course.
She privately told me she would love a koala, but I told her we don't, we can't handle you and the koala, so it's one or the other. She got upset, but that's a conversation for another time, though. But it's now in the book you go on to say basically it's during this time while you're with your sister and working in the park here that you kind of it sets the stage for you to decide that you're going to go to Greece. Um, so in your mind, when you're thinking about why Greece of all places, was it just like you were saying to kind of rediscover yourself?
I came to Greece from a place of complete ignorance, in the sense of a lack of knowledge of what was there with Greece. And when I say that now, it sounds crazy. I
Okay.
now cannot imagine not knowing about Greece.
Uh huh.
Um, but I had never traveled to Greece. It had never been, center stage in my mind as a
Hmm.
destination to visit. I'd had it, kind of on the edge of my plans.
Hmm.
We thought, oh, that'll be a cool place to go. But I knew very, very little about Greece. In growing up in South Africa, Greece wasn't a major part of our school curricula.
Okay.
Um, I think all I knew about Greece was Mykonos and that kind of, the typical
Sure.
idea of the Cycladic Islands. Um, what actually stirred me to go to Greece itself was that for a long time when I say a long time, probably about 6 months, I had come to this awareness that what I needed to do to get over this blockage that I had about travel was to find somewhere magnificent to travel, and I wanted it to be somewhere that would um, would push me a little bit out of my comfort zone, in the sense that there
Hmm.
would be a language that I couldn't speak, a currency I
Hmm.
wasn't that familiar with, a place that I didn't know my way around. But I didn't know where this place was. And I was actually having a supremely bad day at work one day.
Hmm.
And and I had no particular travel plans. I was scrolling through the World Heritage site.
Okay.
Sorry, the UNESCO list of World
Yeah.
Heritage Sites. And I was scrolling alphabetically through the countries, just aimlessly, just wishing I was not at the office on that horrible day.
Mm.
And I hit the G's and I saw Greece and I saw the sites and I knew immediately that was where I need to go. And I bought my ticket within a couple of days. I was there within a month.
Yeah. 44 hours to get there.
It's not always 44 hours to get there. I remember going through look, it's not far off. It's usually probably around 37, 38 hours
Okay.
to get there. It's because there aren't direct flights and we have to go all the way to the northern, from the southern to the northern hemisphere and then across. And there would be, that might not all be flying time, but then you've got 3 or 4 hours that you're waiting in a connecting airport. And
Okay.
so, but that particular time, I remember working out that, I'm very privileged to have the means to travel, but I also do need to watch my dollars a little bit. And I remember working out that I was going to save, I can't remember how many $100 it was, if I took a series of connecting flights instead of flying with two flights.
Got it.
So I ended up taking 4 flights there and saved myself a few $100s. And I remember thinking to myself, if somebody paid me, $600, whatever it was, if somebody said, I will pay you $600 to sit in a chair for 10 hours, watching TV, would I do it? And the answer is yes, I would. So I figured it was worth spending a little bit longer on the way there. But it was a killer flight. Coming back home was even longer. It was close to 50 hours.
Wow.
And I don't know that I'll do it again.
Or take class flights.
Or maybe stop somewhere on the way over. I'm going to Greece again in a few months, and I'll actually have a night in Istanbul. What is now Istanbul on the way over there. So that makes it a little easier.
Well, we will be there later in our summer, your winter. So probably July we'll be there.
Okay, now I'll be there in April.
Wow.
So I'll miss you.
You're gonna have a great time. So let me go back real quick. So this trip, when did it take place?
The initial trip from the first book was in 2016.
Okay. But then you go on. You talk about then reading your late mother's travel journal.
Yes, and I have it here.
Do you?
This little book over here.
Yeah.
Scrawled in very bad handwriting with cryptic notes that were incredibly unsatisfying to read because she is a very different woman from who I am.
So this was a journal from 1978.
That's correct, yes.
Reading through that, did it inspire you at all?
I don't know if inspire is the right word, Peter.
Okay.
It was a very meaningful experience for me to read this diary, but not at first. As I said, I found it very frustrating at first. So I didn't know that this diary existed until a couple of days before my flight. I had already booked my tickets when my sister gave me the diary. And my mum and I, we didn't have the closest or best relationship when she was alive. And I always just say to people, this isn't some terrible memoir of childhood abuse or anything like that. We were just a regular mother and daughter. But she died when I was in my 20s. And we had a bit of a difficult time of it. And then I moved away from home. And so we never achieved that kind of closeness that a lot of adult daughters have with their mothers. And I've always regretted that. So when I received this diary, it felt like a gift and it felt like a way to get to know my mum. And then when I started reading it, I just found myself frustrated. I found myself not recognizing the woman in the pages of this diary at all. But something did happen to me during that trip. And it was a first step towards me finding peace with my mum and getting over those regrets and resentments and, baggage that I had carried. I always say there's nothing like travel to get rid of emotional baggage.
Sure.
I was actually in Mateora when I had the moment that started me on that journey towards reconciling with the past. And it was very much linked to this journal, and I actually remember, sort of having that kind of moment of, I guess, inspiration in a way, but more a moment of insight is perhaps a better word. When I was lying in bed after a long, long, long day with a lot of walking from one monastery to another, and kind of reaching over and fumbling with the light switch and getting the light and getting the diary and turning to the front page, checking the date that she wrote it, and realizing that she had been the same age I was when she went on this trip, and feeling for the first time in years or decades or possibly ever a moment of affinity with her, of realizing, yeah, maybe we failed in some ways in our relationship, but we were two adult women who went to Greece at the same time in our lives and found something there. And that really turned a page for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me about Dimitri, because your tour guide while you were there, it seems like the way you spoke about him, there was an affinity for him to some degree. Can you talk a little bit about him and what kind of clicked
Yeah.
for you with him?
So I only had a couple of hours with Dimitri, and
Yeah.
yet he made such a big impact on me. And I
Yeah.
don't think that my relationship with Greece would be the same if it weren't for him. Dimitri was the tour guide on a free walking tour that was a perk or a freebie that you got with if you went on one of those hop on, hop off sightseeing buses.
Yep.
So literally, I did only spend, although now that I'm thinking about it, I stayed for his second tour, and together they probably, the two tours together probably went on for 5 or 6 hours, that held our group absolutely spellbound. And I feel like, if he had lived in ancient Greece, he would have been one of the great orators. His passion, his excitement, his zest for history and for what we were seeing was so infectious that he had me, even though I was I was exhausted. It was the day after this huge trip. I didn't know anything about what I was seeing. And I remember just thinking, I'll stretch my legs for a bit. And this guy transported me to ancient Greece. He had us sitting just outside on the steps, sort of going down from the Acropolis to Plaka, down some back steps there. And he had us all sitting there, and he was telling us about Alexander the Great. And, I could sort of feel, not just me, everyone, we were all sort of edging closer and closer to the edge of the step as we got more and more engrossed in his story. Yeah. And I think that passion that he imparted just set me up for the way I was going to experience the rest of Greece.
Yeah.
So I did actually try my second trip to Greece. I did try and find him. I actually mention it in the beginning of my second book, but it didn't go anywhere. I didn't find him. He wasn't working that day. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to get into contact with him and say, hey, you probably didn't realize it because it was all in a day's work for you, but you changed my life. Because not only did he give me this excitement and receptiveness for my travels, but if that hadn't happened, I probably would never have become a writer, and that has changed my life.
Wow.
So you never know who you're going to affect and how.
Yeah. So tell us about, so you were talking about the Acropolis. So you finally get to the Acropolis, and there it is in front of you. And so I've been going to Greece regularly. My brother hasn't been in over 50 years. And he plans to go this year. I'm just curious, when you finally get there and you can see it from the distance and you can see the Parthenon, what are your first thoughts?
Interestingly, my first thoughts, it was a hot day. It was a hot day. I mean, it was Greece in September, right? So it was a hot day. And getting up there, I was confronted with confronted sounds almost like a hostile word, but I came across a few very small details. There was a cat. There was a cat that was lying curled around some, there was a cannon and these rusting metal cannonballs, and the cat was curled around this cannonball as if it was absorbing the heat on such a hot day. There were these small details, and I was looking at those things, and then suddenly I had this feeling, this kind of juxtaposition of the mundane and the magnificent.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I was, dealing with these kind of everyday human sensations, and needing to find a bathroom, being, and there was that, here I am at the Acropolis and I'm looking for the public bathrooms, that juxtaposition of these centuries, these millennia of glory, and the reality of me being me in my body was just such a surreal feeling. It was so amazing. And then once I kind of flicked that switch, I was walking around and seeing, the caryatids, seeing the little temple to Nike, which, is so small compared to everything else, but has these perfect proportions. It was an unforgettable experience.
Yeah. You talk about, I just want to let people know who don't know the Temple of Athena, for Nike. It's not, there's no sneakers there. So people shouldn't be going there and be like, oh, you got the new Michael Jordans at the Temple of Nike, And you talk about the Porch of the Caryatids there, where, the originals are now indoors at the Acropolis Museum. But the big point of contention with the one that is in the British Museum in London, and how for decades now the Greek government has been trying to get it back from the British government.
She needs to come back to her sisters.
She does. And I was actually back in August, I was at the British Museum, specifically went to go see her. And of course, they had that section cordoned off.
Really
Yeah.
interesting.
And I'm like, I need to go see my sister. She's in here. They're like, who's your sister? I'm like, she's about, 6 feet tall. She's white. She has a marble complexion, But,
Brilliant. Sisterhood is a real theme in my book. My sisters, I was surprised when writing the book how much the voices of my older sisters spoke to me as I was writing. And the caryatids really felt like a metaphor for that, in a sense. And maybe the reverse is true as well. But yeah, I mean, the Parthenon marbles need to come back, and she needs to come back. And we keep on hearing how close we are to this. And yeah, I hope we'll see it soon.
I agree with you. Towards the end of the book, you make some comments about, you refer to the economic hardships in Greece. What was your perspective on that? I kind of found it interesting that you would mention. What did you see to recognize those hardships?
I saw a lot of people on the streets, some of whom would be Greek and some of whom would have been refugees from nearby countries. I saw a lot of people on the streets making a living out of, walking around selling ballpoint pens for a few cents. And I figure nobody would be doing that if they didn't have to, I saw a lot of people working incredibly hard in the tourism industry and being aware that in some of those places, they would only have that work for maybe 4 months of the year when the tourists were there. Yeah. I spoke to people I chatted with a lot of people while I was there and spoke to people who, I might be talking with a taxi driver who would be talking about his mum and how hard it is for her with the pension, the old age pensions being cut.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I guess it made me realize, I come from a country where there is a huge amount of poverty,
Mm-hmm.
a massive, massive amount of poverty and people living below the breadline. And it made me so conscious of how privileged I was, because here in Australia, I work in a fairly low level admin role. I'm not wealthy by Australian standards, and yet I have this ability, both in terms of time and money, to travel the world. And that wouldn't be the case if I was living in South Africa, and it might not be the case if I was living in Greece. So I'd be talking to people who, I remember particularly, there was one guy who I talk about in the book who was a waiter at a place I went to on Santorini.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me where I'd been before I'd come to Santorini. And I'd just come from Meteora. And before that, I'd been in Monemvasia.
Mm-hmm.
And when I told him those places, I mean, he was a little surprised. I mean, those are not way off the beaten track by any means, but I guess a lot of people who come to Santorini just go to Mykonos and Santorini.
Yeah.
And he was so excited to hear my impressions of those places, because he'd watched documentaries about them and he was so interested in their history, and he'd never had a chance to go there.
Yeah.
And I had just hopped on a plane, so I guess that was a real moment of realization for me and of appreciation for what I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to what you're saying about you kind of go find yourself in Greece, I've been going regularly the last few years, but up until that point, it was a long time since I went back. Um, Now being Greek and being there and being surrounded with people that speak your language and know the culture, it is. And I tell my brother all the time, and I tell him about the experiences. It's a bit overwhelming to some degree, because it's like this feeling of belonging just encompasses you, and you're like these are my people type of mentality, and it kind of embraces you. And these are people who, they know you're Greek, especially, my brother and I speak the language fluently as well. So when we go there, you're right in the middle of it. People treat you like your family. Even our own family, who we haven't seen in decades, just kind of embrace you, like you've been there all along, and it's magical. And I'm looking forward for him to finally um, experience that, because it is
Yeah.
magical. Now,
Yes. And I've heard you say on some of your previous episodes, Peter, and I laughed because I have the exact opposite experience of this particular phenomenon that you experience, which is that you go there and at first you don't speak Greek.
well,
And
yeah,
then once you've had sort of the beginnings of your conversation, you start talking in Greece in Greek, and you have this kind of surprise, but also this amazing welcome.
yeah,
Now I have the opposite experience because I do not speak Greek. I have some phrases of tourist Greek,
mm-hmm,
and what I have I've had so many good interactions with people where
yeah,
I can't tell you how often this happened to me. I'll step up to the reception desk at a museum, for example,
yeah,
and we'll go through the basic kalimeras and
yeah,
yasas, and that a lot of tourists do say, and then I will trot out my best, most rehearsed phrases, and I will say, "Θα ήθελα ένα εισιτήριο, παρακαλώ," in my really bad Greek. And I will get greeted by this flood of enthusiastic Greek response. And then I have to say, signal me then catalaveno, which is my most used phrase. And then the person will laugh and say, I was just telling you what Greek you speak, but obviously I was wrong. And that starts this amazing interaction. So even though I am not Greek, there is something very special about the way Greek people have made me feel welcome in your country. And I do have a sense of, it's presumptuous to say homecoming, but there's a reason that I titled my second book, Repacking for Greece, a Greek Odyssey, a Mediterranean Odyssey. And that is because, an Odyssey is not just a voyage, it's a voyage home.
Sure.
And there is something about the culture of hospitality in Greece, the philoxenia, that does. I'm not sure what the word is you said. Did you say embraced or enveloped? There really is that feeling of going into a place of acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, it's genuine as well,
Yes.
So,
and I've experienced that also, Peter, since I've experienced that in my journey as a writer, because when I wrote these books, it didn't occur to me what a welcome they would receive from Greeks of the diaspora. I wrote the books as a tourist for tourists. I definitely wrote the book from an outsider's perspective. And it was important for me to not in any way claim, kind of ownership, for want of a better word, of these experiences. This was something that I came to as a traveler, and I expected that my books would be read by travelers. And the welcome that I have received from Greek Australians and Greek Americans particularly has been just incredible. Even Greek Canadians. I was in Canada a couple of months ago. I went up to visit my nephew. And my second book is all about how I was trying to go to Canada, but ended up having to go to Greece instead because I had a visa issue. Terrible thing, huh? Having to go to Greece instead.
Yeah.
It was amazing. It was such an incredible trip. But I finally got to Canada last year, and that's on the same trip where I started in LA and I worked my way up the coast to Vancouver. And I was staying in Vancouver with my nephew, and I walked down the road, and he just stays in this little suburb, and there's a little independent theater, and I saw a poster from across the road, and I thought, my eyes aren't that good anymore. I'm in my 50s, but does that say something about Greece? And I went across, and it was a Greek film festival. That was going to be happening. And then I thought, oh, well, it'll have already passed, or it'll be in 3 months' time. No, it was starting 2 days later. So I got home and I got onto the emails, and I contacted, a friend of a friend who is a Greek Canadian who I have not met personally. And he put me in touch with the organizers, and I bought a ticket to go to their opening show. Just went, said hi, gave them a couple copies of my book, thought that would be it. And, they included me in the official welcome of the film. And I was, it's this kind of hospitality. It comes from Greece, but it is so evident in Greeks around the world.
Yeah, 100%.
So is the movie version of the book opening up soon, just so we know? Because that's usually what would come next.
Yeah.
I did take a very touristy photo of myself when I was in LA, holding an Oscar and a copy of my book. But I think that's as close as it's going to get to Hollywood.
You never know.
Yeah,
you never know. So this trip, this journey that you took to Greece, did it help you reconcile the past, specifically the incident in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I was determined that I would travel by bus as much as I could while I was in Greece. And Greece has an excellent bus service, long distance bus service.
Mm-hmm.
And it was scary for me. There were some scary moments. The driving in Greece is a little more full on than it is here in
Oh, yeah,
Maybe not quite as
100%.
full on as in Sri Lanka, but there were a couple of moments, and it was something that I wasn't always approaching kind of rationally. I may have been perfectly safe, but because I was dealing with these deep fears that I had, it was scary for me.
Yeah.
But I got around the country. I got around the country primarily by bus, and have done so in my previous travels to Greece.
Yeah.
I might have been the only person on the bus wearing my seatbelt, but it did, and it gave me this sense of being alive back. When I talk to non-Greeks,
Yeah.
I say that Greece is the country that made me fall back in love with my own life. But when I talk to Greeks, I say it was Greece that gave me my kefi back. And that's something, that is a debt I can't ever repay.
Well, it'll cost you a couple pieces of baklava, but it can be repaid.
Peter, I'm still excited about the baklava ice cream that you talked about a few episodes back.
Oh my God. Listen, we'll talk about that off air. I don't want to take up this time because I'm going to have it soon. But anyway, I just want to see if my brother has any questions.
No, I just think I think it's an incredible story, especially because we hear a lot of these stories from different perspectives of people where the main protagonist in the story is Greece, as somehow this elixir, this gateway that people walk through and they come out different. And it's kind of, I thought you were going to say when you tell your story to Greeks, they go, of course, it's Greece, where it's like, it's like us after my Big Fat Greek Wedding came out, and we're like, we should have ran video on our camera years ago. Mm-hmm. Because it's, we invented language, we did all those things. And so I think it's, I think that's just cool. I guess the one question I was going to ask is, when do you get the little pied a terre, the little second home in Greece? Because you got to set that up, right? I mean, that's the ultimate privilege right there. I go to Australia, and then every 6 months I go back to Greece.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I can't see it happening soon, but it's the dream, right? One thing I would like to do someday is take an extended period of work, like 4 or 5 months, and go over the winter period and just go somewhere that is, not, it's not gearing itself up to tourism. It is just, maybe somewhere on the Peloponnese Peninsula, maybe Nafplio, somewhere near Nafplio, maybe.
I'm going to put you in touch with somebody that you two will be two peas in the pod.
Yeah.
And when you go back, we'll talk off air. When you go in April, we talk to him on a regular basis. I'll tell you who he is afterwards. But him and his wife will love to show you places. But we'll talk about it off air. I
have an idea who it might be. We'll check off air if I'm correct.
Yeah. But I think the two of you will be, like I said, two peas in a pod. And I know you'll have a great time. But listen, Sally, thanks for joining us today. We love to have you on the show. So when you go back to Greece in April, is that for the purpose of writing another book?
Yes and no. So I'm going over for 7 weeks. I'll be spending 6 of those weeks in Greece in various locations. I think I'm staying in about 15 different towns.
Okay.
One of those weeks in the middle will be in Cyprus. It'll be the first time I'm going to Cyprus.
Okay.
one of the weeks will be at a writer's retreat that I go to every time I go back to Greece. And that
Okay.
is the place I consider my home in Greece. It's
Okay.
near Methana on the Peloponnese.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a manuscript that I started almost 2 years ago now, which, if it ever makes it to paperback, will be called Packing for Crete.
Okay.
I had an incredible trip in Crete in 2023,
Mm-hmm.
where I really want to talk about how landscapes can be layered in stories, because, well, all of Greece, but especially I found it in Crete, these layers of stories from ancient mythology,
Mm-hmm.
all the way up to contemporary novels. And, you've got
Mm-hmm.
Nikos Kazantzakis, and you've got these war memoirs, both from Cretan resistance fighters and from Allied forces during World War II. And there's all these stories and how I experienced them traveling through Crete. And I've had this manuscript on the go, but pretty dormant for a long time now, and I have to see. It's time to see if this manuscript has legs or not. Is it going to make it to a book, or is it, have I left it too long and I have to shelve it, because unfortunately that is a reality of the writing life as well.
Yeah.
So I'll be spending that week, it'll be a now or never moment for this manuscript at that writer's retreat.
Well, I hope it all works out for you.
Thank you.
So again, Sally, thanks for coming on the show. The books are Unpacking for Greece, and the other one is Repacking for Greece.
Yep, I have them
and I
here.
believe they're both. I think
I'll
they're
put that
both
there.
available on Amazon, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, they're available at all the usual online suspects. And also, indie bookstores and libraries. I would like to give a huge shout out to libraries. I was so excited when I was in Portland, in Oregon, and I went into a library and I found my book on their shelf. That was a huge
Awesome.
moment for me. My on the cover of the book is a photograph of my mum and my gran at the Parthenon. In the old days when you could just climb up those steps before we had the protections that we do now.
Yeah.
And, I just thought, what would my mum and gran think? They're on a library shelf in America. So please, a lot of libraries will actually purchase books if you ask them for them. So, you don't have to buy the books. You can get them from your libraries as well.
Awesome. So this concludes this episode of Baklava and Banter. I am Petraki. That's Soto. And once again, thank you, Sally Jane Smith, contacting us all the way from Australia. Until next time, everybody, be good. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, yes.